Several years ago, lots of years ago, when I was in college, I took a racquetball class. It was a tough one. I was in the last year of school. I just needed to fill some credit hours, and that looked like a good one. So I started in the class. We learned a little bit about the history of the game, spent lots of time playing. And, I did pretty well against the other people in my class. There were only about 8 of us, and they were all kind of looking to fill their schedules the same way I was. But I quickly thought more highly of my racquetball game than I should because of the competition in the class. And I was doing well, and so I was talking about the class and with my roommate. And he said, well, we should play sometime. I said, that would be great, let's do it. And my roommate at the time was one of my best friends. We'd grown up together. He ran track, and I was a soccer player, and we had grown up as kids together. He sort of liked sports, but just kind of did it for something to do in his spare time. So I thought this would be fun because he's decent enough of an athlete that it'll be some competition, but I'm sure I'll probably mop the floor with him, and that's always good, right? So we went to play, and he wasn't very good. He went out and bought a racket so we could play, and the goggles and the whole nine. And he wasn't very good, but for some reason I couldn't pull away from him in the scoring. He was just right there. And in the first game, I started to get a little nervous that, man, he could actually pull this thing off. And sure enough, I choked, and he won the first game. Now let's play another. We're going to play another game, and this time I'm going to really put it on him. Then. Well, now it's in my head. Second game, he wins again. Now I'm frustrated. Play again. Third game. He is crushing me by the third game. And he's still not good at this game. Now I'm just ticked off. Just mad. I'm mad at myself. I'm just mad at the world because I'm getting beat in this game that I should be winning. And I'm not just getting beat in this game, but in the last couple games, and I'm never going to hear the end of it. And about 3/4 of the way through this game, I hit another terrible shot. I get to the ball, I hit it, terrible shot, right off the floor. The ball kind of hits the floor, off the front wall, and bounces high, coming back to the back of the court. And out of my anger and my frustration, I just overhead slam this thing, right? Big grunt, ah! And I just smash the ball. And as I make contact, I realize that Scott is standing about 10 feet directly in front of me. And I instantly think, oh no, I've killed my best friend. Everything goes to instant slow motion because he's turned around because the point was over. He turns around and he just stands there. The ball right at him. Hits off the toe of his shoe. And we're both kind of looking at each other, mouths agape. Ball hits off the toe of his shoe, comes square back, and smokes me in the forehead. Boom! Down I go. Both of us in tears on the floor. Big purple welt, looked like an idiot. I come from a long line of angry people. We have just enough Irish blood in us on my mother's side that it doesn't take long to get under our skin. I remember my grandfather would lash out and get angry at the smallest thing. His brothers were the same way. I've heard that the generations beyond that were much the same. I grew up knowing that my anger could be a real problem if I didn't get it under control. Some people are just angry, aren't they? We've been talking about lots of different qualities that we deal with in other people. Anger is a difficult one. It comes on so quickly at times. And it creates such incredible conflict and damage in relationships that some of those relationships never recover from an outburst of anger. And so it's important for us to talk about how to deal with angry people, whether they are loved ones, neighbors, or ourselves. Anger is expressed in a really wide variety of ways, isn't it? It's difficult because some people just lash out immediately, and it's loud and it's boisterous and it comes at you strong and heavy, and you just kind of either retreat and run away from it, or you have to respond so that you don't get blown away. But other people don't react in their anger that way. I know and have known several people that when they get angry, they internalize that anger. They allow it to fester and make them bitter. They may not say or show anything on the surface, but that anger stews, it brews inside of them. They hold on to it and save it for later for some reason. Some people express in words that they're angry. They come out with hurtful language or lace everything with this biting sarcasm. Other people express it by just mumbling and grumbling as they walk off. You can't really hear exactly what they're saying. You just know it's not good. Other people go straight to silence and they show you with their expression, but they refuse to tell you with their words why they're angry or how it might be resolved. Anger is a strange emotion in the way that it gets expressed. And then there are some people who just seem to be immune to it altogether, aren't there? My father-in-law is one of those. I've seen him mildly perturbed a couple times. But in 24 years, I don't know that I've seen him really angry, maybe ever. And I think, how does he do it? I've certainly given him reason from time to time to be angry. And yet he just seems to be patient. He deals with it well. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, in your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. This verse tells us something that I think is important to start with today. Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. That tells me that anger itself is not necessarily a sin, but our response to it certainly can be. Anger is not necessarily the problem. It's our response to it or our reaction to it, whether that is someone else's or our own. You see, anger is a natural emotion. It's a natural response to some outside stimulus. Something that happens to us or around us. We perceive an injustice. We recognize something that is unfair and hurtful to ourselves or someone that we care deeply about. And anger is the first emotion that we may recognize in these natural life experiences. Even Jesus got angry. It's rare, but he did. The Bible tells us a couple places about Jesus being angry. And so we know anger itself isn't the problem. Mark records one of these times. Mark says Jesus, looked around at them, referring to the Pharisees, in anger. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, he said to the man, this was a man who had a hand that was disformed. So he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Now, in this story, it was the Sabbath, and Jesus came across a man who had a disfigured hand or arm, and Jesus had compassion on him. He felt for the man and desired to heal him, but Jesus also knew that the Pharisees were watching to see if Jesus would heal the man on a Sabbath, which would be considered work. And as they watched and looked on, Mark says, Jesus looked at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He immediately turns to this man and says, "Stretch out your hand." And when the man does so, he's already been healed. Now, if this doesn't sound at first read like a full antagonistic attack by Jesus on the Pharisees, he looks at them, he knows what they're watching for, he knows what will set them off, and he says, "Stretch out your hand." And when the man does, he's completely healed. If we read the story that way, it would feel like Jesus is poking the bear. We can't see it in the English translation, but in the original language, in the Greek, we have to look at the tenses of the verbs that are used. It says that Jesus looked at them in anger, and the expression in anger is an expression of momentary past tense feeling. But then the very next phrase, "he was deeply distressed," is a ongoing present tense form of the word. So as we read this simple statement, he looked at them in anger for a moment, and then was deeply distressed. It was an ongoing distress that just didn't go away. He was distressed at their stubborn hearts. His distress was continuous. So if we look at this example from Jesus, momentary anger followed by a distressing concern for their attitudes and their hearts, and we lay that against Paul's instructions earlier, we can understand that Paul is telling us, when you are angry, it's probably going to happen at some point. Paul is telling us to be in control of it, to manage that anger in a way that's appropriate, to deal with that which makes us angry. When you experience yours or someone else's, the challenge for us is to control the response. Like a dam that holds back the raging waters of a flood. Or maybe for some of us, like the control rods in a reactor core that are used to manage and control the nuclear reaction. You see, the challenge is to come into and engage the anger in a way that isn't too much, but also isn't too little, to avoid the meltdown that could come from an incorrect response. I mentioned it a week or two ago that psychologists believe that anger is a symptom emotion when it's expressed, that when you see anger in somebody else, it's actually communicating a deeper issue for them. That anger is expressed when someone feels fear, when the unknown or the uncertain is pending. Sometimes people fear what's coming, and the response is anger. A cancer diagnosis can bring on expressions of anger. Other health issues do the same. Uncertainty in the markets with our jobs and the future stability of our finances can cause people to speak in anger. You see, when we're afraid of what's coming, sometimes we communicate in terms that are angry. Other people respond in anger out of being hurt, emotionally or physically. I remember another time when I was in college, I was playing volleyball with some friends, and I kind of stumbled and fell, and I kind of was near the side of the room, and when I fell against the wall, my hand hit kind of oddly, and I broke my hand. It wasn't anybody's fault, it just happened, but I remember in that moment knowing that I had done something significant to my right hand, and the emotion I felt was anger, which seems strange at the time. I'm not angry at any person, I'm just angry at the pain that I'm feeling in the moment. As I thought about what the consequences of my injury would be, I was a math major at the time in college. I can't type my homework in my math classes. I have to write it. I'm right-handed, and now my right hand is of no use for the next 6 weeks. I was angry because of the pain and the inconvenience that I was going to suffer over the next month or so. Some people express anger out of fear or hurt, but sometimes we also express anger out of disappointment. I thought life was going one way and it turned and went another. I expected to receive one thing and I got nothing or something different. Disappointment sometimes causes us to respond in anger. This is why we so often see anger brew up over time in marriages. The most intimate of human relationships, and sometimes we treat our spouses with more anger than anyone else, and a lot of times it comes from unfulfilled expectations. We're disappointed that the relationship we dreamed of and expected isn't exactly as we had thought it would be, and we become angry because of that. Proverbs 15:1 gives us a good mantra to consider when we think about anger. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. This was a verse that my grandmother used to quote often. She was married to my grandfather. I think it was probably one that was etched in on her heart pretty deeply. When she saw anger in us, she would simply say, "Now guys, the gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." She would remind us of this truth. This word gentle refers to a tender, receptive attitude. Someone or something that's able to absorb whatever is coming toward it. A gentle, supple, receptive attitude. An answer that is like that turns away wrath. A harsh one that is filled with pain, is an aggressive, hard response, the kind of response that digs one's heels in against whatever's coming at it. A response that goes on the offensive and attacks the conversation. A harsh word escalates, grows, is like fuel on the fire of an argument. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. You see, the trick is to respond, as I've said, not too much and not too little. Gently, but engagement nonetheless. You see, running from anger seems to not be an appropriate response either, if we just let it go. again, if it's with someone else, somebody else's anger, if we just ignore it, we don't address it at all, that anger then festers and continues. If we come harshly against it, it stirs up that anger. And so a response is almost always necessary. But a gentle answer, one that is receptive, one that's tender, is the right response. We see also in the scriptures that the anger, as it's dealt with, needs to be dealt with carefully. When someone's angry, the dancing between too much and too little can be a tricky endeavor. The Bible tells us that anger should build slowly and resolve quickly. When you come into a conversation and you can sense that the other person's angry, it's important for us to recognize this truth, that if there's already a certain sense of anger from the other person, we have to be cautious in how quickly we try to run to the end, for fear that we might build the anger too quickly. And yet, again, as I said, we can't simply retreat, because it needs to be resolved. The Bible says that we should resolve our conflicts quickly. So, turns out that the old advice to count to 10 is pretty good advice. You see, counting to 10 gives you opportunity to consider your response. It gives the other person time to think about maybe what they've said, and gives you also opportunity to come back and engage it. We're not counting to 1,000,000, we're just counting to 10 or maybe 100 if you tend to also be an angry person. If we look back at the example where Jesus was angry in Mark chapter 3, he had right to be. You see, in Mark chapter 2, we read several accounts where Jesus had already engaged the Pharisees. In Mark chapter 2, the Pharisees had ridiculed Jesus when he healed another lame man. The Pharisees had ridiculed Jesus for eating with tax collectors and sinners. They were likely involved in ridiculing him when his disciples were not fasting, when other disciples were actively fasting. Pharisees ridiculed Jesus' disciples for picking grain as they walked through the fields in the afternoon, and they began to eat just a few of the ripe grain. Pharisees ridiculed them for that, and now they watched Jesus on the Sabbath. A man with an arm that is disfigured, desires to be healed, and they can see that Jesus has compassion for him. He feels empathy toward the man, and they're just watching so they can come at him again. They've been creeping in the shadows for weeks. Everything that Jesus did, they had an issue with. And now when he desires to extend grace and goodness to a man, to restore his arm, that his life may be completely changed going forward, Jesus felt anger because he knew their hearts. He understood what was really important to them, the law over the individual. And Jesus felt short-lived anger in the moment. But then that was quickly overcome by a long, ongoing heartache for them. He looked around, and in his anger, he felt deep distress at their stubborn hearts. You see, he not only had compassion for the man who had a difficult life, but he had compassion for the Pharisees who had lost sight of what was most important. His heart was distressed for them. James says in chapter 1 of his letter, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. When I was in high school, my youth pastor was a single man in his 30s. He was almost always available to us whenever we wanted to spend time with him, and we spent time with him constantly. Went to school events with him, snow days. We would go tear around the countryside, just having fun. And we're just constantly with Bob. We were middle schoolers and then high school boys, and so we tormented him incessantly. He drove a stick shift truck, and so we would show up to youth group, and at some point during the night, we would sneak out of the building, kick his truck into neutral, and push it to the far side of the parking lot into the dark. So then he would come out and have to figure out where his truck ended up. We would get into his apartment if he was away for the weekend, TP everything. We just constantly tormented that poor guy. He never got angry, except for maybe once or twice. I remember one time we had this big event, and there were other churches involved in it, and we went to the event. They had all these big games planned for all of these different youth groups to kind of intermingle us with these other students from around the county. You know, we were there with our friends, but we were put on teams with other kids, and we decided we didn't really like that. We wanted to hang out with the kids we knew and our friends, and our attitudes went south pretty quickly. And so we didn't participate, and we didn't really join in, and we kind of half-heartedly engaged with the other students, and it didn't take long, and Bob lost his mind. Yelled at us in front of the whole gym. Our attitudes were terrible, and we were making the event not very fun for anybody involved because we were sabotaging the games, and you know, everything he said was absolutely true. We hadn't seen Bob respond that way. We had never seen him angry before, but we realized in that moment we had crossed a line some time ago. And he was letting us know it was time to go back. Over the next several years, I saw that response, that anger in him, maybe 2 or 3 more times. Not only was it always warranted, but it probably could have come hours, if not days before. He was long-suffering with us, but when he did get angry, he dealt with us directly. He was honest with us. He was clear about his expectations and his desires for us. And as soon as what needed to be said was said, he loved us again. We were forgiven in the moment, and I can't help but think of Jesus' response to the Pharisees, who were just constantly looking for a way to trap him or accuse him of wrongdoing. And Jesus did get angry. He took care of the situation. He did what was right in the moment. He was clear about his expectations, about God's expectations, for how we would treat one another. And his anger dissipated, and his distress for their stubborn hearts replaced it. You see, anger ought to be developed slowly or built slowly, but it needs to be resolved quickly. Again, Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. And then he says, and do not give the devil a foothold. And this is why this is so important, to allow anger to grow slowly, but to resolve quickly, because our anger is leveraged by our enemy against us and those who harbor that anger, or who are the subject of our anger. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul talks about love. And at the very heart of his comments on love, he says, love is not easily angered. It's not that love is never angered, but it's not easily angered. And then his next phrase says, and it keeps no record of wrong. It builds slowly and is resolved quickly and put behind us. All of these passages, Paul's instructions to the Ephesians, his letter to the Corinthians, Jesus' example with the Pharisees, all of them have something in common, and that's time. It's the way they went about dealing with it. People who are quick to be angry or seem to always be angry, they need to manage time. And sometimes we have to help them manage time. Time to process the situation. Time to assess what's really going on here. Are you afraid? Are you wounded and hurt by something I've done? Are you disappointed in the outcome of the circumstances you find yourself in? What's driving the anger? How intense is it? And is there something we can do together moving forward to resolve it? Processing takes a little bit of time. But providing a place to resolve, promising that we're not just going to let it go is important for us. When you receive someone's ire, or when you feel the anger building, remember the importance of the timing of your words. Maybe you need to hold yours. Perhaps you need to give them an opportunity to express it. If they need time, offer them that time. Be gracious enough to allow them the time to process what's really happening. But don't just let it go indefinitely. Come back to it and to figure it out. And be committed to this last thought. In our anger, the Bible tells us, we must do no harm. In our anger or in someone else's, we must be cautious to do no harm to the other person. We know that the devil leverages our anger against us. That he uses it, that we might say something without thinking through the consequences. That we would lash out and respond in a way that wounds or harms someone else. And quite often we're pushed to deal too quickly or not at all. Paul gives instructions about anger to two different churches. To the Ephesians, just a couple verses after the one we've noted a couple times. In verse 31, he says, get rid of all. And then he gives us a list. Bitterness, rage, and anger. Brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. He gives almost the exact same list to the church at Colossae, to the Colossians. In chapter 3, verse 8, he says, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. These two verses are almost identical, and he gives a list of common responses to a person's anger. He starts off with bitterness, rage, and anger. This word bitterness is an embraced hatred for another person. In fact, the root word was often referred to as a root that you can't see underground that will grow and produce fruit later. It's an agricultural term. And Paul says, get rid of bitterness, that type of embraced hatred out of your anger that may not respond today, but is going to save a response for later. Will produce a bitter fruit. Terms rage and anger, one of them, rage, refers to an instant flare of heat and emotion, when you feel your blood pressure rise and you know that your face and your neck are getting flush, you respond instantly. The other is, again, like bitterness. It refers to an abiding desire for revenge. I'm going to sit on this one for a while. And when you're not expecting it, then I'll bring it back up. I'll use it against you when you've let down your guard. The middle of these lists talk about brawling and malice, a desire to physically injure another person. The word malice means a willingness to break civil codes of justice. I'm willing to pay other consequences for acting in a certain way, lashing out at you now. And then the lists finish with slander and filthy language, injurious speech toward another, obscene or vile communication. If we look at the list, Paul's telling the church, when you're angry, refrain from emotional harm, bitterness. I'm just going to use this against you over the next 10 years or 20 years. I'll bring it up every once in a while. I'm going to savor this one. I'm going to withhold grace from you as we go forward. I just want you to know that you're on shaky ground with me. And I'll determine when you're okay again. It's emotional harm. Paul says, put it away from you. Have nothing to do with it. The middle of the list talks about physical harm. Lashing out physically at another person. Paul says there's no place for it for us. And the last one are these injurious forms of speech, slander and filthy language, this sort of public social harm that we cause one another with our words. We declare out loud so that others might hear of your offense. You've made me angry, and I want everyone else to know. What a despicable person, inconsiderate person, foolish person you must be. So that everybody can kind of feel the same way. It's doing harm to relationships. It's burning the ground around them. And Paul says, get rid of all forms of emotional harm, of physical harm, and social or public verbal harm that you might cause. In your anger, do not sin. In your anger, do not harm another person. In your anger, be sure to cautiously walk through it. In another person's anger, manage the time well, so that you don't run into it too hard, but that you don't avoid it altogether. Because the devil uses our anger as a foothold to destroy our relationships with one another, and sometimes to eat away at us over years with that which is unresolved. Anger's a nasty one. And that's why Paul instructs us to be slow to be angry, but quick to resolve it. Let's pray. Father God, we come before you today, recognizing that in our anger we often respond without thinking, we react too quickly or not at all. And God, you've instructed us to be mindful of our response, to be aware of our emotions, to be sensitive and gentle to the emotions of others, to not dismiss or neglect, but to engage appropriately. Lord, may we be a people who diffuse anger within ourselves and with others. Lord, will you give us the ability and the skill to do it well, that anger might not be the issue that destroys our relationships, that the devil might not have a foothold to drive us away from you and away from others. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.
I will sing your goodness. I will sing your grace. I will love you all my days, all my days. Oh, my soul, lift up the name of the one who saves. He reigns forever. Oh, my soul, lift up your praise. I will rise and bless the Lord. Oh, my soul, lift up the name of the one who saves. He reigns forever. Oh, my soul, lift up your praise. I will rise and bless the Lord. Oh, my soul, oh, my soul, oh, my soul, oh, my soul, oh, my soul. I've carried your burden too long on my own. I wasn't created to bear it alone. I hear your invitation to let it all go. I see it now.